Today we're going to use histograms to organize and display data in the appropriate graphs. Our goal is to use histograms to display data sets. So, what is a histogram? Well, we can see that a histogram is a graph that displays data from a frequency table. It has one bar for each interval that contains data values. The length of the bar indicates the frequency of the interval. Frequency is the number of values that lie in an interval. In other words, the frequency is how often a number occurs. A frequency table is used to group data values into intervals. In other words, you don't want just number 1 occurs this many times, number 2 occurs this many times. When you have intervals that are up to 50, for example, that can get very tedious, so we can cluster them in together. And when we graph those, we graph them on a histogram. Go ahead and take a minute to pause the tutorial to write down your vocabulary. Some common mistakes to avoid are confusing a histogram with a bar graph. There's a big difference. With a histogram, we're talking about intervals, for example, 0 to 20. And then 21 to 40, 41 to 60, or 0 to 19, I should say, etc. And then, again, a bar graph is just usually one representation of numbers and how often that number occurs. So these two graphs are not equal. Another important note, in a histogram, unless there's a gap between intervals of numbers, the bars are touching, whereas in a bar graph, the bars are separated out. Another common mistake is students will repeat intervals. For example, especially like I said from 0 to 20 and then 21 to 30, that actually is not the right balance of intervals because I have technically a group of 21 in the first column and a group of 19 in the second. So your intervals have to be equivalent groups. And also, sometimes students will repeat numbers. So watch out for those two common mistakes. So let's look at an example. Science. The number of named stars in a group of 34 constellations are listed below. And we can see all of these numbers. Choose the best way to display the data. So, in this case, the best way to display the data is to create a frequency table and use a histogram. So we have to look at these numbers and ask ourselves, where's my smallest number? My smallest number is 0. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what's my absolute largest number? So going down the list, I can see that 15 is my largest number. And from 0 to 15, now in this case, 0 counts as a number. That is 16 numbers. Again, think about it. 0, 1, 2, 3. That's technically 4 numbers. You can count that on your fingers. And from 0 to 15, that is 16 numbers. So next we can ask ourselves, how can we group them? Well, I have 16 numbers. What's a good way to group 16? I could group them in groups of 2 and have 8 rows or 8 bars on my histogram, or I could kind of bunch them together a little bit more, and I think that a good group would be groups of 4. So with my frequency table, I have my interval, my tally, and my frequency. And I'm going to type these out for you because I know this is going to be a little crowded. So it's important to know the 3 steps. Step 1, make sure you write these down. Choose intervals of equal size that cover all the data values. Step 2, make a tally mark next to the appropriate interval for each data value. And step 3, write the frequency for each interval by totaling the number of tally marks for the interval. So, I am using graph paper here to make it a little bit easier. So again, I have groups of 4. My lowest number is 0, so I'm going to write that in here actually. 0. And my groups are 4, so I have 0, 1, 2, 3. A common mistake is students will say, oh, from 0 to 4, and then 4 to 8, etc. And then they're repeating numbers by mistake. So then I have 4 to 7. Again, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then I need to go on to my next number, 8 to 11, and finally 12 to 15. Always double check your intervals. Make sure that you're using equal intervals, in other words, intervals of 4 in this case, and make sure that you're not repeating any numbers. Now I'm going to tally how often I see 0 to 3. So with my tally mark, I'm going to say, okay, I have a 0, 0, I have a 2, I have a 3, a 1, a 0, a 2, a 1, a 3, a 1, a 1, a 2, and another 1. Almost missed it. And I'm double checking, scanning, and I'm pretty sure I got them all. So I can, of course, always come back to that. Oh, no. I did miss one. I have that too. So my frequency, now I think I'm pretty sure I got them all, is 14. And I'll go a little faster with the rest. Now I have my 4 to 7s, and that occurs 9 times. And if you have a highlighter or something, sometimes it's easier to do these in different colors for you. Now let's move on to 8 to 11. That one occurs 7 times. If you're using your interactive notebook, go ahead and highlight these in different colors. That might help you. And then the last ones, of course, I have 12 to 15, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, because I have my original 15 there. So now I have my intervals, tallies, and frequency. Go ahead and pause the tutorial if you need to write down all those numbers and to write down your frequency table. So here I have my intervals, my tally, my frequency, and now I'm ready to make the histogram. So I'll just scroll down a little so that we can still see our interval, tally, and frequency. And now I'm going to draw my histogram. So on the bottom part is where I'm going to put my intervals. So now I have my histogram. I have my intervals at the bottom. So I'm going to label those my named stars. And then vertically I've chosen to go up in intervals of 2. Just because, you know, my highest number is 15, so going up by 1, I'd have a much bigger graph. And now I'm just going to create my little barriers to help space my histogram apart. And now I can start labeling my frequency. So my first frequency is 14. So from 0 to 3, it shows up 14 times. Now, 4 to 7 shows up 9 times, so that's halfway between the 8 and the 10. And notice how the graphs are touching. Again, that's the difference between a bar graph and a histogram, is the graphs are touching. Finally, I have 7, again halfway between 6 and 8. And lastly, I have 4 going up to here. So now I can color them in. And now I have a clear way of describing my data using a histogram. So I have my named stars in intervals. And I just checked my graph and realized that I needed to make a change here. 8 to 11, 12 to 15. Again, always double check to make sure your intervals are correct, because you don't want to make those common mistakes. Now, that's right, it's your turn. Read the guided practice problem. School lunches. The number of students in your class who brought a lunch to school each day for 2 weeks are given below. So we have 7, 15, 5, 8, 12, 16, 3, 6, 9, and 11. Make a frequency table and a histogram of the data. So think about how many numbers there are and how can I group these into a good frequency. Then you're going to, of course, graph that on a histogram. Don't forget to use the tally marks as well. Those are going to help you. Go ahead and take a minute to pause the tutorial and complete the problem on your own. In this lesson, you have organized and displayed data using histograms and frequency tables. Remember to avoid common mistakes like confusing bar graphs and histograms. Make sure your sides are touching in a histogram. And also make sure that your intervals are spaced evenly. And don't forget to count any zeros if you have them. I hope this tutorial has really helped you with coming up with more ways of displaying your data. Great job!